Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a really significant Supreme Court ruling, one with some immediate impacts, and we're basing this on details from a recent high-profile press conference. Our goal here is to really cut through the noise, get straight to the essential facts, the figures, and what this all means, focusing on what was actually said in that briefing.
Exactly. We want to give you a solid, impartial look at what was presented in this specific press conference. It definitely offers a particular viewpoint on the ruling's importance. And we'll get into their specific points about executive power, policy impacts, maybe some you weren't expecting.
Okay, so let's start with what the source called a monumental victory for the Constitution, for separation of powers. What was the absolute core of this ruling?
Well, the main thing, the focus was on these nationwide injunctions, sometimes called universal injunctions. As they explained it in the press conference, these are court orders where basically any single federal judge out of nearly 700 could dictate the law for the entire nation.
Wow, one judge.
Yeah. Effectively blocking or, delaying policies from a president, sometimes for years, just by getting them tangled up in the courts.
And the speakers we're drawing from, they didn't mince words, did they? Calling it a colossal abuse of power.
They did. And they made a point of saying it never occurred in American history prior to recent decades, claiming there were more recently than in the whole 20th century combined.
That's quite the claim.
It is. And what's interesting is how specific they got about where these came from. According to them, out of 94 federal districts, just 5 specific ones, Maryland, D.C., Massachusetts, California, Washington, were supposedly responsible for 35 out of 40 of these nationwide injunctions against the president's authority.
They called those liberal districts, right?
That's the term used in the source, yes. So they were clearly highlighting a perceived pattern there.
Okay, so connecting that back to the Supreme Court, what did the court actually do about this? What's the holding?
Right. So it was a 6-3 decision. Justice Barrett wrote the opinion, joined by Roberts, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Thomas. And the key holding is that district courts lack authority to enter nationwide or universal injunctions, period.
So no more one judge stopping things for the whole country.
That's the takeaway presented in the press conference. They explained these injunctions gave relief to everyone in the world instead of the parties before the court. And they said this ruling stops district courts from becoming an imperial judiciary. Okay,
this sounds like it could change things fast. What are the immediate policy consequences they talked about?
Yeah, the big immediate thing they highlighted was the ability now to, and I quote, promptly file to proceed with numerous policies that have been wrongly enjoined on a nationwide basis.
So basically restarting things that were put on hold.
Exactly. And the source listed quite a few specific policy priorities they felt were blocked by these injunctions and could now, move ahead. Things like ending birthright citizenship, ending sanctuary city funding, suspending refugee resettlement, freezing funds they called unnecessary, also stopping federal tax money from paying for transgender surgeries. And it affects policies on tariffs, military readiness, immigration, foreign affairs fraud, too.
Let's circle back to birthright citizenship for a second. That got quite a bit of airtime in the source material, didn't it?
It did. The argument they presented was, quite specific. They claimed it was originally meant for the babies of slaves, pointing out it was enacted on the exact same date, the end of the Civil War. And they explicitly said it wasn't meant for people trying to scam the system and come into the country on a vacation.
Okay, that's a particular interpretation of the 14th Amendment.
Yes, and they backed it up with claims like hundreds of thousands of people are pouring into our country under birthright citizenship, and that cartels have used it to get very bad people in. That was the framing.
But, just to be crystal clear, based on what they said, the Supreme Court didn't actually rule on whether the president's birthright citizenship order itself is constitutional today, right?
Correct. They were very clear on that. The source material states the actual constitutionality will be decided in October in the next session by the Supreme Court.
So how does this ruling affect that issue then?
Indirectly, by making it a case-by-case thing now. So the example given was if you have a birthright citizenship case, say, in Oregon.
Right.
The ruling in that case will now only affect the plaintiff in Oregon, not the entire country. That's the immediate change from this ruling ending nationwide injunctions.
Got it. Okay, beyond the injunctions themselves, the press conference seemed to really dwell on frustration with what they call rogue judges.
Yes, there was a lot of discussion about judges who, they claimed, blocked virtually all of President Trump's policies.
And what was the practical impact they described? Besides just the policies being blocked.
Well, they talked about the sheer administrative burden, how it forced their lawyers to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just dealing with emergency appeals and stays.
So, diverting resources.
Exactly, pulling them away from other administrative work.
Yeah.
They gave examples like an order preventing DHS from moving individuals to a third country that got held up, an order affecting military readiness implementation at the Department of Defense, even one that forced them to reinstate fired executive branch employees, all tied up in these legal fights sparked by injunctions.
The source also mentioned another major ruling today, something about transgender books. What was that about from their perspective?
Yeah, they brought that up. They described that ruling as restoring parents' rights to decide their child's education. So that it allows parents to opt out of dangerous trans ideology, framed it as a tremendous victory for parents. So clearly focused on curriculum and parental control there.
Okay, so the injunction ruling was definitely the main event, but it sounds like they used the press conference to cover a lot of other ground, too. Other initiatives, other wins, as they put it.
Oh, absolutely. It was quite wide-ranging. For instance, on law enforcement and border security, they announced 2,711 arrests just today in HSI investigations, Homeland Security investigations, specifically targeting, in their words, terrorists and these gangs, naming groups like TDA, MS-13, Sinaloa cartels, said it was a top priority.
And they touched on economic stuff, too. Taxes, trade.
Definitely. They discussed a massive tax cut bill, warned that if it doesn't pass, the country faces what they called a 68% tax increase.
Wow, that's specific.
It is. They also claimed the bill cuts costs by $1.7 trillion by tackling fraud, waste, and abuse. And on trade, they asserted hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs have come in with no inflation whatsoever. Claimed companies and factories are moving to the U.S., mentioning over $15 trillion in new plants and equipment.
And a bit of a jab at other countries.
Yeah, the sentiment that some countries are used to ripping us off on trade was definitely expressed.
What about crypto? That seems to pop up everywhere now.
It gotta mention, they framed it as a very powerful industry, one the U.S. has dominated, and that it takes, quote, a lot of pressure off the dollar. Interesting perspective there.
And foreign policy wasn't left out either, it sounds like.
Not at all. Some pretty stark comments. Mentions of Iran's nuclear sites being, quote, obliterated, ensuring they will not be nuclear. Said they'd consider bombing if intelligence showed Iran could enrich uranium significantly.
Strong words.
Very would. Also talked about a great relationship with El Salvador, praising its fantastic leader and massive prison system. Other things mentioned included NATO members boosting funding, preventing, they said, nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan, and even a peace treaty signing between Rwanda and the Congo, which they also said included the U.S. getting mineral rights from the Congo.
Okay. And a few final points, more domestic maybe.
Yeah, some criticism aimed at California's governor for, quote, giving away everything to people that nobody's seen before. Also critiques on the state's wildfire management, blaming water issues, and quite a direct comment on the risks of being president, citing a specific statistic about the mortality rate of the job.
So, wrapping this all up, thinking about the listener.
Yeah.
What's the big picture here?
Yeah.
This deep dive into the source material really paints a specific picture, doesn't it?
It certainly does. The clear perspective coming from this press conference is that this Supreme Court ruling on nationwide injunctions is absolutely pivotal. They see it as resetting the balance, restoring executive power, and basically unlocking a whole slate of policies that were previously stuck. The phrase used was the Constitution being brought back.
Right.
And this really shows how even court decisions that seem procedural, about how cases are handled, can be presented as having massive immediate effects across the board. Immigration, education, the economy, everything. The source material clearly reflects a strong belief in the executive's right, maybe even duty, to push forward the agenda based on their electoral mandate.
So it leaves us, and you, the listener, with something to think about.
Exactly. How might this change, this curbing of nationwide injunctions, really alter that balance of power between the courts and the executive branch going forward? And maybe more practically, what could be the long-term effect on just how quickly future national policies get put into action or perhaps challenged? Something to definitely keep an eye on.